I'd say go for it, Joe.
Okay, I will go for it. I was with Glenn and I was also with Keaton, and we talked about the fact that we are getting to the under the iceberg issues. Like when we talk to people and there's a wall up, what is really the issue at hand? Is it the whole wall, or is it taking it apart brick by brick? And then what are we doing to educate ourselves? And so like Glenn shared that he really took the summer to deep dive and really educate himself about some of the movements that were going on and unlearning what he had grown up idle thoughts, and then really just getting deep, and then having, and all of us were like getting to the conversation of what's going on, the heart of the matter, not just the big front wall of things.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Someone else, number 2.
I'll go. In our group, we discussed primarily like how your experiences in life and as you go throughout life change how maybe a belief system you were taught from your parents or your home situation taught you throughout life. You get to an adulthood and you realize, or you have to unlearn that maybe that is not an okay thought process, or you have your own different personal beliefs in that area. So experiences in life and empathy of learning about the people that you surround yourself with, what they've experienced, impact how you think and feel in regards to hot topics. And developing your own personal belief system. We also talked about like historical changes, and we talked about like staff members, even last year as we get ready for going back to school, you know, traditional mindset of teaching face-to-face. Now, 1 year later, we had a historical event and we're all pushed or forced into thinking creatively or differently, which has expanded what we know, and we're unlearning what we did last year because that's not working under the current situation. So I guess experiences and historical events, empathy towards others and their histories too.
Yeah. Shannon, thank you very much. And one more volunteer, please. What might he be asking us to unlearn?
We also talked about change and just sort of how, whether we're asked to unlearn changes in political climates, in cultural climates, or just like in the school, how we constantly have systems that we're learning and then changing and unlearning. So we talked a little bit about that, and biases, unlearning our biases, which other people kind of talked about. Yeah, and so we kind of covered the same points.
Yeah. Haley, thank you. And everyone, thank you very much for sharing those thoughts here. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and getting on with our slides here. So if you can all see that, and let's continue with the next slide here. And so why this session today? A couple of reasons. One, and Corrine, who's on the call here, asked a couple of months ago what opportunities there might be for some new staff members who are coming maybe new to our buildings, or maybe didn't have a chance to participate in some of the recent trainings that others in that building had and what's available. And I said we were planning on doing some things here in the fall. Back in May and early June, we weren't quite sure what this was all going to look like based on the coronavirus, et cetera. So part of the rationale and the purpose behind this session was to provide two things. One, some background information about MVP. It's what we call it 101, some entry level things to know about MVP. Bring on some folks who have been implementing MVP and working closely with it, and talk about some real practical things, right? This is a really a practitioner's discussion or conversation around MVP. Secondly, was what was emerging for us last April and May were some of the connections between MVP and some of the social emotional learning competencies that schools are beginning to increasingly have, right, in their professional development. Certainly SEL and social emotional learning is not new to a lot of our colleagues in the earlier grades, younger grades particularly, where we as an educational enterprise, we've struggled and found it very challenging to find meaningful opportunities, curriculum programming, time, et cetera, for social emotional learning discussions or curricula, et cetera. And what we were beginning to see and understand was these competencies of SEL emerging within those students, right, who were A, mentors, but also B, some of the ninth grade students who were on the receiving end or working with those mentors. So again, why this session? It's the students in our buildings who are taking up the challenge and really stepping up and lending their voice and their thoughts to this bigger, broader discussion, right, around health and safety, around respect for relationships, around culture and climate. And in doing that, what we've discovered or are discovering are some of the really important key elements that are emerging. So we have two slides here. This slide and then a slide that I'm going to ask Dr. Fleming to just briefly describe that we talked about last Tuesday. But as you know, many of you know, social emotional learning, in terms of its definition, that's, it's a core set of principles, right? So Iowa has 5 competencies that we'll discuss here in this a little bit, and really how can we as educators and partners in education work, collaboratively together to provide students opportunities to practice the skills and knowledge and opportunities, right, to continue to grow socially and emotionally. And we know, big picture, that as school districts and school buildings that really are intentional about social emotional learning practices see declines in discipline referrals, declines in absenteeism, aggressive behaviors can be reduced. Along with that, maybe more severe incidences of crime that might lead to some type of juvenile court citation, et cetera. Anyway, so there's some reasons why. There are some things to expect to happen in our culture with SEL, but also the positive things with regards to increased rates of graduation, self-efficacy, and social skills. Now, intuitively and anecdotally, those of us who have been using this model for 20 years, we've seen and watched some of those things kind of manifest themselves. Dr. Fleming, would you mind taking a few minutes to briefly kind of describe what the 10,000-foot view of what we discovered and talked about on Tuesday's session, and then we'll continue on. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So we were interested, as the spring unfolded, to touch base with the mentors that are doing the work across the state. So, as many of you know, we sent out a survey to the mentors, and we were basically asking a couple core questions that kind of follow up some questions we had asked several years ago at a MVP luncheon. We asked them, how has MVP had an influence on how you see things or how you look at things? How has it had an influence on you in terms of what you do, and what have you learned about it? What kind of skills have you developed? And we were pleased to receive responses from over 300 students, and these were open-ended questions. We also asked them how touch base how they were doing during the COVID-19, and as on a side, a theme of that really. It's interesting to hear them express about concern about their mentees, their students, and wanting to get back in touch with them. But the bulk of the items that, or the narrative that we looked at was in response to those 3 questions, and they just type, and some of them a few sentences, some of them a paragraph or so. And as we were reading these and reviewing them, we were starting to see some strong connections to these 5 SLE competencies. And over the course of the summer, we had a couple graduate students that were working with us to kind of look at these responses, these pages and pages of responses, and to start to identify themes and issues that came out, time and time again. And in the SLE competency areas, there are 5 core competencies, and you see them in this table here. Responsible decision making, being able to kind of identify problems, analyze situations, solving problems, reflecting, self-management, looking at being able to regulate one's emotions, managing stress, controlling impulses, motivating self, social awareness, perspective taking, empathy, appreciating diversity, respecting for others, and relationship skills, looking at how do I develop healthy relationships. So one of our graduate students, she went through all of the narrative and kind of a several step process, quantified how many responses related to each of these different competency areas. And about half of the responses could identify or link to increasing or being able to kind of analyze these situations, the decision-making process. And you can see the percent of the other competency areas. So at one level, we know that, MVP and the mentors that are doing the work speaks to, pro-social behaviors, bystander behaviors in a direct way, leadership development, but it also speaks to the social emotional learning and the holistic holistic view of the mentors and as they're doing the work in the schools. So we're going to be kind of exploring this further as we kind of move forward in some of our evaluation work and some of our discussions. But I think it really helps provide an additional way to kind of think about and talk about MVP in your schools and the connection that it's making to educating and the learning of the holistic child and specifically what it's doing with the mentor. Some of the survey information that we collect from the students that are receiving the program shows some similar changes or similar impact on some of these competency areas: perspective taken, empathy development, feeling responsible, taking ownership for creating a healthy culture within the school. So we want to just kind of, as Alan said, pick up from where we left off to kind of provide that framework. As we move forward in the rest of the training and the slides, you will see some of the activities and ways that we have seen it connect to some of the SLE competency areas. So on some of the slides, you'll see a text box at the bottom where we kind of see some of those connections.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. So we sent you, or you have a copy of the slides that has all those connections that we were making. We went through each of the competencies, and so you have that information along with, again, that YouTube video of the conversation on Tuesday. So with that in mind, let's just keep on going here, and really want to again take this.
Alan, can I interrupt real quick?
Sure.
You are recording, right?
Yes.
Yep. I see. Okay, great.
Thanks. So for those of you who are brand new to MVP, I apologize for going fast. For those of you who are very familiar with MVP, I apologize for going too slow. How about that? So anyway, we talk about MVP kind of having these kind of 4 domain areas about raising awareness and challenging thinking, open dialogue and discussion. What's that look like and sound like? And finally, inspiring leadership. 20 years ago, when I first saw these 4 domains of MVP, before I really had really gotten into the model very deeply, as a school educator, it began to really make sense to me that, well, we're talking about some of these same things in some of our other discussions around the whole child, or around, we weren't, 25 years ago, we weren't necessarily talking explicitly about social emotional learning, although Castle was certainly an organization that was thriving and beginning to really try to find some ways to, engage conversations with students around these competency areas. But anyway, from day one, it seemed to me that MVP was really helping us meet the needs of some secondary school students that maybe we weren't doing as much earlier. So for the next few minutes, I want to kind of walk through real quickly these activities, which we call the hallmarks, or I would say the signature activities of MVP, in terms of its training, but also the implementation, and how we, those of us as adults who go through the training, how we then interpret those activities and bring them and walk our student mentors through those activities, so that they can have some of the same, opportunities to challenge their thinking. As Mark Twain said, what might I need to unlearn? So students, we know the mentors that in that survey share with us just increased levels of awareness and understanding about how prevalent some of these behaviors that were invisible to them before they'd gone through the MVP training, or before they had been in the position of a mentor. And so this ongoing kind of awareness or aha moments around behaviors, expectations, what's healthy versus unhealthy. It was really fascinating, and always has been fascinating to listen and to watch young adults like our mentors and some of the freshmen that they serve kind of have those moments. So these are the key activities that we're going to kind of go through, and then we'll get right to the panel discussion. So the first one is framing MVP as a leadership program, and really talking about the different ways in which individuals can lead, right? What are my skills, my gifts? Knowing that there's not one correct definition of leadership. We have all examples of all kinds of ways people have led or mentored us. And so really an important activity or discussion is to really stop, call time out, and ask students and staff members alike, how do you define leadership? What's the word for leadership for you, and why? And so, as you can imagine, we create these enormous lists and talk very explicitly about the different ways that we lead and that others lead, and that there's no one right way to do so. I'm going to share a short video with you. I hope this comes across real well, so check your audio. I apologize in advance if this doesn't work. It worked when I tested it earlier. Jackson Katz, the founder of MVP, in this video is talking to a room of about 300 high school mentors. This is at Western Iowa Tech in Sioux City, Iowa, 2008, 2009, I believe is when it was. Anyway,
hey,
talking
Alan,
about, I'm sorry?
can I say something about leadership real quick?
Sure.
I really want to encourage people, because this is kind of my thing that I do. Your leaders can also come from your negative kids that have a lot of leadership qualities. And so to turn them from a negative leader into a positive leader in your school really does help with your disciplinary problems. It really does, because then they start to get the kids that have followed them in the negative path into a positive path. So remember that leadership can also be negative, but we have to figure out a way to kind of turn it into a positive. Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so Jackson's going to talk a little bit about that connection between leadership and then being that good friend, or that person that says, I'm not okay with this, but what do I do? How do I respond to this? So here we go.
And it includes everybody, because everybody's a bystander, right? Everybody's a friend, a teammate, a classmate, a co-worker, a family member. Everybody has peer cultures and social groups. The idea here is to say to people who are bystanders, who are friends, teammates, and classmates, What can you do to speak up? What can you do when you see abusive situations? What can you do to support your friends, to challenge your friends, to interrupt the abusive behavior when possible? But do it safely, but do it. And that was the heart of our thinking when it came to creating the MVP model. And my feeling from the beginning has been there's an awful lot of young people, men and women, boys and girls, who are not comfortable with the abusive behavior that we see around us. We don't appreciate it, we don't like it, but we often don't do anything in the face of it because we're scared, because we don't know what to do, because we haven't seen it modeled for us before, because there might be social pressure on us to be silent. Because, you know, silence comes up over and over again when we're talking about bullying and harassment and abuse, doesn't it? And it's not just the silence of the victims. Because, again, a lot of people think, okay, victims are silenced by what's being done to them. And I appreciate that does happen. But you know what? Bullying and violence and harassment silences more than just victims. It silences people around the victim because they don't want to become a victim, and it silences people around the bully or around the abuser because people don't want to become the victim. And often we also know from research over the past generation that an awful lot of abusive behavior is enacted by boys and girls who are popular, not who are some schoolyard bully standing on the corner, with kind of ominous looking in the ogre Shrek-like sense, but rather normal, average people, including popular people, right? So oftentimes the person doing the bullying has some social power, and so people don't want to challenge the bully because they don't want to take a risk that by challenging the bully or the abusive person, they're going to somehow get it back on them. So what happens is an awful lot of silence as a result. And again, I'm convinced there's an awful lot of people out here, and out in the world, who are good people, most people are good people, who just don't say anything, they don't do anything. So how do you get them to say something, and how do you get them to interrupt other people's abusive behavior?
So that's the essence of what this model is attempting to do, is what he just asked there at the end, these students. How do you get people to open up and to talk about these things? And from a practical standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, in terms of school buildings, is that you need to create some time and a place for that to happen, right? And so we'll talk about this more with the panelists talking about how do you schedule, how do you organize and implement a model like this or other models similar to it that really invoke the opportunity to share and to open up, and what are some ways in which we can facilitate that. But one of the main pieces is that let's teach a strategy, right? Let's teach the process that many of us do intuitively, but let's be very explicit in terms of, so we're all on the same page, right? So that we all know that this is what we're about. We want students to notice language, words, comments, innuendos, behaviors that demonstrate forms of bullying, violence based on gender, race, ethnicity, all of it. We want to notice them as a community. And then the next part is we then now we have to all interpret, right, what's happening. And this is where we start to see the divide, where some people see the situation and say, it's no big deal, that's just the way it goes. And there are others that are really appalled and put out by it and say, that's unacceptable. Well, we have we have those different perspectives alive and well today in media, on news stations, in public discourse. And so it's not a new concept to have differing perceptions, but as a community and culture, here in our school building or in our classroom or in our peer groups, what is it how do we interpret these behaviors? Again, and so some of the activities are designed to start to maybe make some of that more aware, or increase some opportunities for some self-reflection or some empathy. If I do see it as a problem, then the next step for us that we're trying to really get people on the same page is to, how do you feel responsible? I mean, what makes a person feel responsible about a situation? Is it because that you're your best friends, or it's your sister or your brother, or it's a teammate, or hey, you've been, they're from the same hometown, or whatever the situation may be, but our sense of responsibility can vary. And finally, if I do all those things, then the next question is, what do you do about it, right? How do you show up? And how I show up has a lot to do with how I see myself as a leader, or how I see myself as a person of influence, or as a person in my peer group, how I feel, my sense of confidence. Again, these are all things that we've been watching mentors kind of develop and grow. And we need to be honest. We need to be honest about what it is that we're up against. And as a society, as social creatures, what keeps us silent, or maybe what keeps us from saying or doing something in a helpful manner, are things that we all have to deal with. You know, a sense of, hey, am I going to get some pushback on this? Is it going to come back on me? As Jackson said, you know, we oftentimes don't challenge or confront, you know, a classmate or a teammate who's being aggressive, either verbally or physically, because I don't want it to happen to me. And that's incredibly important to say out loud and acknowledge to individuals. I think it's someone else's responsibility, right? It's like, I'm not dealing with that. That's not my job. That's not my role here. Or I don't think I have the influence. All of these different types of dynamics can feed into or keep a culture silent. And what we know is that when cultures and environments, especially schools, you know, there is a code of silence. You quote unquote will use the word, don't be a snitch, don't be a narc. I mean, we use those negative terms to keep people silent, when in fact the majority of folks would agree that what's happening is not okay. But if there's an unspoken social norm here that says, if you say something, you're a narc and you're going to be in trouble, hey, I'm out as a young person. I'm not going to say anything, right? So how do you start to chip away at that social norm that says, hey, you know what, don't say anything? We have to start thinking about, is standing up for and defending the health and safety of others, is that an act of leadership, or is that being a narc? Is that being a responsible citizen and practicing some of my, you know, the things that I know are, you know, society-wise virtuous and helpful, or am I going to be seen as you know, a goody two-shoes, or other derogatory phrases and words that we as adults we use? So that's important for us to kind of acknowledge those. But here's another example of an activity that MVP includes as a way to start getting those different perspectives on the table. It's called agree and sure disagree. And so here's a statement that we use in our trainings, and I want I'll share it with you out loud, and then I want you on your button. You have over on the right-hand side, the lower right-hand side, you have a thumbs up button or a thumbs down button. And I realized that there's, I don't think there's a level hand for, like, I'm not sure, but we invite participants, students included, to respond to this. So if a friend is abusive to their partner or is being abused in their relationship, I need to do something. If a friend is abusive to their partner or being abused in their relationship, I need to do something. So you personally need to do something. Do you agree with that? Are you unsure, or do you disagree with that? And I'm going to just stop sharing right now. And to that point, that statement, thumbs up if you agree, thumbs down if you disagree, and if you are unsure, just leave it blank. All right, and I see several thumbs up. I see some.
I don't know where my graphic is at.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. You can just do a visual like Joe too as well. Thumbs up. All right, thank you. Real quickly then, what we would do in the training session is we would look at the groups, and so we could theoretically have three individuals or three groups assembled, right? Agree group, a disagree group, and an unsure group, right? And so we would pause, and as a facilitator, I would say, for someone who agreed with this or had a thumbs up, why did you agree with that? And I'm going to just pause for a moment. Can somebody who had a thumbs up, could you just in a very short soundbite share with this group here today, right now, why you agree with that statement? Anybody?
I guess for me, it's kind of like, if something is known to you, then you can't ignore it.
Yeah.
And so there's many different ways that I could get involved when it comes to a friend. For myself as an advocate, sometimes I step out of that advocate role to be more of a friend and just kind of determine what's best for them, what are they wanting to do, but still, checking in with that person, doing something at least so they have resources, somewhere to turn.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. To everybody here, why might one of our colleagues disagree with this statement? Why might a colleague disagree, or someone that we're working with in a training session? Why might someone disagree? Any thoughts?
I know I had one kid that was like, yeah, it's none of my business. What happens between them happens between them. I am just staying out of it, because if they break up and then they get back together and I've said something about them, then I'm going to be the one that's at fault.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe.
Or I've seen it so often that it became the norm.
Yeah, or it's how often that's the norm. Thanks, Martez. So that's, again, it's a staple, a part of the discussion. And when we facilitate the trainings with adults, we really encourage then you to go back and help the mentors practice facilitating this exact activity, because and there are several statements that are used throughout their different scenarios that really lend themselves to some great discussions. And 99% of the time the discussions go fairly well. There may be some raised voices, but again, with between the mentors and the teacher in the classroom who's there as a supervisor, I can think of maybe one or two times in these last several years where someone had to intervene or to say we're done. But it's a time to practice respectful listening. It's a time to, and especially if you've done your homework up front and set some ground rules for the sessions beforehand, which I didn't mention that earlier, but again, that's kind of a part of the whole mantra of setting up these sessions, is coming to some agreements, and those are all included in the trainer's guides, etc. But this is what it looks like, right? I mean, you physically have folks standing, back in the pre-COVID days, standing within 6 feet of each other, right? In groups, and then having a conversation and then listening, right? And so some of what people say might be persuasive, some of it might not, but the point is that you're practicing open dialogue and you're getting all voices out on the table. And that's a really powerful moment for youngsters and adults, I think, to understand and taking other people's perspectives. It's certainly a part of the competencies, the social emotional learning. The next major activity, called Types of Abuse, Types of Respect, invites participants, adults or students, to identify examples of verbal abuse, emotional abuse, technological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. Conversely, asking students and adult participants to identify verbal respect, examples of verbal respect, emotional respect, technological respect, physical respect, and sexual respect, and certainly in the confines of a relationship, right? Whether it be intimate or close. And so, as you can imagine, you get a lot of words on these sheets of paper, and we then list them on a wall. And as you can see, Paul Breitbach here from Iowa City West High School, then talking and asking some facilitation questions to the mentors about what is this telling us? What are people seeing and observing as a result of this activity? And we ask participants to be fairly explicit in their responses. In other words, when we talk about verbal abuse, if we're not talking about the words and phrases that kids hear and see in school buildings and hallways, then we're not being authentic, and we're not being serious about the fact that how can we talk about inappropriate language and words and phrases that are meant to demean, degrade an individual if we can't say the words? And I realize that this can become a very touchy kind of a interesting area to navigate around. But again, we want this to be as real as possible. And I guess you have to, think about this when you're facilitating or having these conversations, leading them, how detailed do you want to be? How specific do you want to be? I lean more towards being explicit, understanding that these words are on this sheet because somebody in this room identifies these as abusive. And if I'm standing in this room and I have used that word before, or I have said those phrases before, thinking that, hey, I'm just being cute and funny, or I'm just going along with the crowd, I may for the first time be in a situation where I have to now reflect on, is what I've been saying or doing, I mean, is it really that bad? And I'm having this moment for myself, and it's a safe moment to think about, potentially challenge some of those behaviors. But basically the bottom line is looking at, we put the sheets in this basic order, not because abuse happens in a linear fashion, but what we do ask are questions like, why might we list them: verbal, emotional, physical, sexual? Why might we put them in this order is one question. Where do you think most people in our building, in our school community, might feel compelled to intervene or say something if they observe these behaviors? And oftentimes, I mean, 9 times out of 10, people will say, when things get physical, it gets my attention and it starts to tell me that things are wrong or things that aren't okay. And it begins to then help set the stage for us to talk about, that's the key, right? How can we get individuals, students, adults in our community to recognize the potential harm and power that verbal and emotional abuse can cause, and to take those maybe more seriously, or to maybe check in more often, or when I see those things, but to be aware of those. I'm going to pause right there. And those of you who facilitate this or have done this before, do you have an interesting anecdote or an interesting situation that you experienced as a facilitator about this activity?
Well, I just want to say, Alan, that I appreciate what you said, because with this activity, yeah, it can be explicit and everything in that regards. And so, there can be some kickback there as well. But again, for it to be authentic, these are words that, like you said, kids, they know the words. They're using these words, whether it's inside the classroom or out of school. And so trying to, again, get that on paper and be authentic with that. So I appreciate that, because I had a little bit of kickback last fall with this activity. But it's like we're not doing this because we just want to say these words. We're trying to get to a point here and talk about these types of abuse and how this is problematic and everything like that. So again, if we're not talking about it, then we're doing a disservice. So again, I just appreciate what you said, because that's very true in nature.
Yeah, thanks. And absolutely, Tom. And oftentimes, most times, this is preceded by a statement about being triggered, right? Words that are triggered, and having that conversation up front. And if you do feel triggered, here are the steps that we can take for self-care. So thank you. Anyone else?
When it comes to the kickback of words and stuff from the teachers, one thing that we found out, because I know this happened last year, was there was a word that was being said in our community that maybe others of different communities didn't understand, because it was regional to where they had been immigrated from. And it was really interesting because it came up, and the teacher had kind of pushed back, but then when we did some further digging, it was kind of a situation between one clan versus another clan, and it was a trigger word to make other people of the opposite clan get upset in the hallways and stuff. And so then we could watch out for it, because it was something we didn't have a clue about. And the other thing is I want to say that when we allow students to be authentic in their experiences of what we're doing and what they're talking about, we build a relationship. When we shut it down right away and don't allow them to have their voice, then we cut off that relationship and we start putting blocks in front of them again. We start building up their wall and reinforcing it so that they don't want to have these conversations. And it's very important that if we don't have those relationships, we are not going to get the information. They are not going to trust. They are not going to open up. And sometimes we need that, because, last year in one of our things, we had a mentor that was practicing this with another student in her grade and was like, oh, that's being said to me. And then they started talking about it, and we were able to open an investigation, and we ended up getting the family some help that was desperately needed. But if they don't feel comfortable enough to share that with each other, we don't have any gateway. this creates a gateway for us in the relationship building.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
I agree, Joe. By giving the students and whoever we are having this type of leadership activity with, we are giving them that authenticity to speak their minds and to share what they're hearing or what they're seeing, because we know that our students, they are seeing and hearing these things that we talk about. So by giving them that space where they can feel as comfortable as possible discussing these tough topics, we're able to build that rapport with them and to continue to dive a little bit deeper with them, which also shows the great importance of having trigger warnings prior to all the activities that we are doing. Because I know when I facilitate these types of activities with students that I work with, there's going to be at least one disclosure, whether it's during or after these activities.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. Anyone else?
Alan, just to make a comment here and kind of circle back to the discussion earlier, the text box there in terms of social awareness and competency. I was just kind of glancing down at the sheet here, and it's, this type of activity, just to kind of make that connection, the ability to take the perspective and empathize with others, including those from diverse backgrounds and cultures, the ability to understand social and ethical norms for behavior and to recognize family, school, and community resources and supports.
Yeah.
The discussion that we're having and that we have with this type of activity, you can really kind of see that connection to the SEL content area of social awareness.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. I guess one of the biggest ahas for me as an educator for 35 years has been my growing awareness of the number of youngsters who suffer in silence and who haven't been able to share what's been going on because there's so much shame and embarrassment and guilt and self-blame that happens. And again, anytime we can begin to kind of weaken or crack that shell and provide some steps and some ways in which youngsters can get help, access help, maybe take that step to trust somebody, it's huge. It's a huge deal. And again, we don't do this haphazardly. It's thoughtful, it's caring, it's what we do. It's what we do. And so a way to depict or to visually show what we just talked about, here's a model, for example, that oftentimes is used to communicate and to share, with some more explicit ways. But you can see how this can become so problematic that if social norms are indicative of those behaviors on the bottom of this pyramid, why wouldn't some more of the behaviors that are listed above towards the middle and top part of this pyramid become much more pervasive and happen with little, if any, type of challenging or confronting or et cetera. And again, in the realm of education, we're about prevention, and we can handle things to a certain level as educators, but then we have professionals, victim advocates, public safety, law enforcement. We have folks who are trained, first responders who are trained in so many of these behaviors after the situation has occurred. But our role as educators is really education and teaching, and that's a part of prevention. So that's again, that's the types of abuse, types of respect activity. I want to keep on moving here. I'm cognizant of the time, and I want to get to the panel discussion here real shortly. But another one is the box activity, and so this is really looking at some of the challenging situations that happen if we try to narrowly define what it means to be identified as a male, identified as a female. And so we create these, an activity helps us create this and verbalize this online. So here's what an activity could look like after it's been facilitated, where we've invited young men and or young women to help identify some different messages that young boys or young men receive about what it means to be a man. And so you'll see those words and phrases inside the box, and they take on a very traditional, maybe machismo, aggressive, in charge, athletic, strong, all those types of behaviors, many of which we're not saying are quote unquote bad, but collectively, if this begins to be only the way in which we define to be male or male identified, it becomes incredibly problematic, because we know that folks who maybe don't oftentimes, live up to or practice those behaviors that are inside this box, are on the receiving end of words and phrases that are very demeaning, and they're very gendered, right? They're words that demean and harm women and girls, or they're words that demean and degrade maybe a young male who may identify as a gay young man. So again, this is about recognizing, but also deciding for myself, how do I want to show up to my friends, and how do I want to be my authentic self, and how, those words inside there, while there may be some of those situations that I personally practice, it doesn't define me as who I am as a young man. Similarly, when we do this with both young men and young women, we can look at some of the traditional stereotypes that, constantly in our world in education, and really expanding opportunities and equity between the different genders. This feeds right into helping support, why do we have a GSA group in our school? Why is it important to talk about gender equality? And so recognizing that we can really, confine ourselves to thinking very narrowly about gender expression, and how, if it's very narrowly defined, how can we open that up and be more accepting of others? So I'm going to pause right there and ask anybody, those of you who facilitate this, would you add an anecdote or an example or a personal experience or a thought related to this activity from your perspective?
I kind of put it in the chat, but I'm going to say right now, as I was watching it, because I have power back and so I can watch TV, I'm so excited about that.
All right.
I was noticing on the media this morning, everybody is talking about Trump's thoughts on Biden's running mate, Kamala Harris, and how he talks about her and the words he uses, and how they're very, they're interesting. That's all I'm going to say. Mm-hmm. And the media is all over that this morning. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Anyone else?
I can take this from Samantha. Okay, so we do not, I know that some communities do, some school districts do the separating of males and females. Mm-hmm. At Marshalltown High School, because when we started this, we had a lot of trans and unidentified individuals or non-identifying individuals in our classrooms, that we didn't want to have 3 separate groups. So we decided, back when Lori and I were doing this together, we decided that we were going to keep everybody together. So we do this as an inclusive exercise, and we have found that they really enjoy this exercise. In fact, SOAR uses it again, which is our Gay Straight Alliance. They use it again for their own meeting. So they get like even more words out that they might hear in their communities to fit within the box or outside of the box. And that's where we learned terms as things like a twink. I hadn't known that term before, but the LGBTQ community, one of the males that actually worked for the state of Iowa with their Gay Straight Alliance told us that it was a male who was small and thin. And that was a word that was being thrown around a lot in their community, and they felt that it had more of a feminine value, and it could be slated as negative or positive depending on how you were looking at it. When a non-LGBTQ person was using the word twink, it was to be negative, but when an LGBTQ person was using it, it could be classifying, what their preference is in dating type. So it's really interesting we use these tools to fight discrimination and violence with the LGBTQ community as well. So all of these tools can be used with the LGBTQ community. And I think it's very important that when you can do it in a setting with everybody together, you can understand some of the issues that might be coming up in the general community, but then when you break it out into an individualistic community like SWORD does for us, then you can really get to what the LGBTQ community is feeling inside as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe, for adding to that. And I would say too that just in terms of a practical facilitation piece, again, you'll discover that people do things a little bit differently. And I think in my experiences, we have generated these lists and we've invited folks to go whichever group they want to go to. But if you male identified, to have the conversation, although I know that my wife and my daughters and a lot of female facilitators that I work with could fill in the man box. Conversely, we could contribute very positively to what are some of the narrowly defined ways in which women are supposed to act and behave, right? And so, I mean, you can have that, certainly by mixed gender. When I do invite male identified together and female identified together, and then have those separately and come back and share and talk about and process those, you're arriving at some of the same outcomes, and that is understanding that what MVP is trying to demonstrate here is that there are some real problems associated to this narrowly defining of what it means to be how we identify, for the very reason that Joe just described. Because in our LGBT community, it is diverse in terms of gender, and so we're looking more fluid in terms of gender. Again, the last 20 years, watching this conversation and how this activity has been informed by society and culture over the years has just really upped the ante in terms of, what are we trying to accomplish here? We're trying to accomplish an understanding that there's a strong need in our civil society to respect all genders, right? And we aren't there. We absolutely aren't there as a society. And so this kind of helps give some voice to that. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. So I want to just pause. I'm cognizant of the time, and before I go to a panel or talk about some of the MVP scenarios, I want to just pause and I've asked Rachel here, Breyer, who's on the call, to talk a little bit about. We mentioned this earlier about just handling disclosures, and I've asked her just to share a few minutes about in her work as a prevention specialist and an advocate working with Riverview Center. What are some of the things to be mindful of for all of us, and working with youngsters, and when a young person, discloses to you that they've been a target of, a harassment or some type of, verbal or physical abuse or sexual abuse. So Rachel, again, thanks for being part of the call, and, help us understand maybe some of the things to be mindful of around disclosures and how important it is to make sure that schools really know who those victim service advocates and prevention specialists are in our communities. I know Eric and Tom and Sam, you're on the call today too, but Rachel, you want to kick us off?
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah.
So as a prevention specialist and as an advocate, just like many others in the victim services field, we know that when we are presenting to any group, that we will be speaking to at least one survivor, just because of how high the rates of sexual violence are in our communities and society. So we know that disclosures from students and adults alike are pretty common, either during or after any discussions that we lead. So knowing how to appropriately respond and what maybe some things to avoid is important when we are providing these conversations. Whether it's a student who's disclosing to a peer, or if they're disclosing to an individual who works at a school, or if a friend of a survivor reaches out for assistance or guidance, there's going to be some similarities in how we can respond to those disclosures. So some of the important things to remember is to keep calm, not to show any anger or disbelief, because we never want that to go back to that survivor and make them think that we are upset with them. We might be upset that it's happening, but we don't want them to ever think that we're ever upset with them for sharing, because we know that when a disclosure does happen, it takes a great deal of strength and bravery to be able to disclose what's happening. And chances are you might be that first person that they feel comfortable enough to share what's happening with. So remaining calm is incredibly important. Even if, inside our heads, we might be freaking out a little bit, that's going to be common, but to remain calm in front of the survivor is so important. Also believing them in their story, especially if they have tried sharing with someone else and they weren't believed, or just because of the different rates and myths that are out there, they might think that it is their fault as well. Some other things that we can do is to just listen to them and support them, validate them. Like I said, it takes some strength to be able to disclose abuse, what's happening. So telling them how strong and brave they are and that we are here to assist them, asking, what can we do? What can I do to support you? How can I help you? Instead of telling them different things to do, such as reporting or talking to someone, because maybe they don't feel comfortable yet reporting or sharing their disclosure with anyone else except for you. So by asking, what can I do to support you? How can I help you? That's also giving that power back to that survivor that they've lost during their assault. Providing a safe environment is also important so that they can feel comfortable being able to share something that's really difficult, and so that you can learn more about what's happening, but at the same time avoiding judgment. Some individuals, they might have the greatest, they might really have great intentions, but even asking leading questions can also be something that we should be avoiding, especially with children. So another thing is to have a lot of validation in supporting them when they're sharing. And by asking them, how can we support you? How can I help you? And knowing what your resources are. So whether it's a student who is disclosing to another student, having those same attributes of having that safe environment, not judging them for what they've gone through or what they have, whether it's how long they've been going through it or for how they've reacted to their abuse, reassuring them and validating them that they did nothing wrong. It's not their fault for the abuse that they've endured. Listening to them and believing them and knowing your resources and who you can reach out to for support, such as an advocate, is also really important. So another thing that it's important for adults to know, especially if we work in a school, we might have specific reporting duties that we need to be mindful of. So if a student is disclosing and they're starting to say something, if you're a mandatory reporter, let them know, like, hey, I'm here to support you and I want to help you as best as I can, but I do want to let you know that I am a mandatory reporter. So anything that you share with me, I'll have to report to my school. Letting them know, because something that many students deal with is that why they don't want to report or share a disclosure with people is because they don't know who to turn to and who that individual that they do turn to, if they will tell anyone else about it. That's why we always talk about and bring up what our confidentiality looks like when a individual reaches out to us. There's many times throughout the years, because I've been doing this work for over 5 years now, and there's been many times where we have students or we have friends who reach out on behalf of a survivor. We had one this morning, actually, asking questions about kits or what it means to be an advocate and how can I support my friend? Or this just happened. What should I tell them? What should I do? Telling them to believe them and support them, validate them, and then letting them know, like, I'm sorry that this happened to you. Thank you so much for sharing this with me. You're very brave to do that. How can I help you? how can I support you? What do you want me to do to help you? Because then we're giving that options to them and bringing the power back to them. So disclosures can be very overwhelming, especially if it's someone that we're working with in our schools, or if it's someone that we know. It can be really overwhelming and it can be difficult. So also take some time for yourself as well for disclosures. If you need to talk to someone about it, you definitely can. You can always reach out to any victim service organization. Every county and every state is going to have a victim service organization that you can reach out to for support if you want to problem solve or if you want to ask any questions. So I think those are some really important things to be mindful of when about disclosures, whether it's a student or it's a friend of a survivor reaching out.
Yeah. Rachel, thank you. And this is a really good segue into the discussion I want to have with some of the panel folks who have agreed to, to share some of the thinking about this. And so, as Rachel mentioned, so translating and working with the mentors and helping them feel confident and prepared as a mentor, what may be some of the things that they may need some extra help and support with in terms of their training, and what does that look like and sound like? So. As we transition here into a discussion with some practitioners in the field who have been doing this for a while, the first question that I want to invite those folks to think about is this idea of mentor training. How do you go about training mentors in your respective building? And maybe back up one second. Identifying the mentors in your building, the training that you maybe did pre-COVID, and also the training that you might be doing now or thinking about doing here in this fall. What's that look like and sound like? That'd be the first question. And in terms of folks to share, I know Joe and Shannon were both have agreed to talk and to think about, share some of their thinking around their work with training mentors and implementation. I also want to invite also to Rachel and Eric and Tom, because I know, and Michael, and I know you have been involved in some training and working with adults and mentors alike. But I want to hear from folks that have some information that would be helpful for those that maybe who are newer to MVP. So to that, I'm going to, and if you would please just unmute yourself when you're ready to share. But let's talk about the identification of mentors and also the training. What's training look like in your building with those kids? So, who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Thanks, Shannon.
First of all, as a school counselor, I saw students who are getting invited to a program that they didn't know much about. They hear the word violence and they are not 100% sure if they want to be a part of it. So selling the program is very important. And how do you sell the program and encourage students to either be a part of it or apply to it? So we have an application process and we open it up to juniors and seniors to apply to be a mentor for our required freshmen. Freshmen are the mentees. Now that I've got the middle school in my building, I will have sophomores apply to be mentors of the 7th grade. And I have that advantage of having them in the same building. And the curriculums are 2 different curriculums, so that tends to help. So in order to encourage the kids to apply, number 1, you sometimes have to recruit face-to-face, walk down the hall and talk to that kid. So have a working list of who you want to have be your mentors, and keep an open mind that every student is a leader and they excel in their own way. So they can provide help in ways that maybe the traditional athletic captain can't provide leadership. So the other thing I did is I looked at the curriculum and what activities they are doing as a mentor, and my students receive credit for a leadership class. Because they are working, they are putting in the time, so they get a half a credit in the fall and a half credit in the spring for a mentor. And with that, we count all the trainings that they do. We have mini trainings sometimes even in the middle of sessions to regroup ourselves. It'd be wonderful to say that you can do a 1 day, full day training and you're good to go for the rest of the year, which we do the full day training, but they remember about half of it. So you have to retrain as you go. I retrain the scenario with the students, with my mentors before they go into the classroom as a mentee. They need to be very close to the experience in order to be able to have a rich conversation with the mentees. And I know I'm talking like all over the place here, a large gamut of things, but it's very important to have that kind of thought process before you go into it. It's easy to say, hey, here's your day, you're going to get trained, here's your scenario, let's go. If to really make it successful, it's got to have an engaged person who believes in the program, and to actually have your classroom staff believe in the program to help support too. Because if your staff doesn't understand why, like John Smith is getting pulled out of PE class to go be a mentor in English 9, it gets a little bit tough, So it's a district communication, it's believing in the program, and I'm gonna tell you right now, the program works. It is the best social emotional program for high school kids, because you can tell a high school kid until you're blue in the face how to act and how not to act, but if they talk to each other about the reality of their lives and they make their own decision, it's way more powerful. The final thing I want to say, and this goes back to what Rachel was talking about, is really think in your training how you're going to train your mentors what to do when somebody discloses. We have to remember they're high school kids. So if somebody discloses, typically they disclose to the mentor because that relationship is there. They're not going to come running to me, school counselor, that they know is a mandatory reporter. So I have a good hour training about, on the full day training, I do an hour on that. And then I reiterate it throughout the year about once a month, reminder, what do we do? And then we have a handbook sheet that parents sign that understands their child has been trained on what to do if a disclosure happens. And not only do I call the survivor's family and talk to them as a school counselor, but I also talk to the family of the kid that it was divulged to. Because they make the reality of somebody saying, hey, I was raped when I was 6 years old, at 16 years old, and it's somebody who sits across the room from them when they think it's something that really doesn't happen in your community. How does that kid process that trauma, that stress, to have that information shared with them? So have a very strong protocol and training process for how to handle disclosure. Those are my recommendations.
Thanks, Shannon. And again, this is being recorded, so folks, you can replay this again. But Shannon, thank you very much. Joe, what would you add?
Well, I'm going to second what Shannon just said. You have to have that disclosure protocol set up ahead of time. We need to have the supports in place for not only the victim or the survivor, but also the person that was disclosed to, the mentor. And we do check-ins with them afterwards frequently to make sure that they're, not taking it on themselves, because sometimes there are some feelings that can manifest that they need to deal with on their own, and with a counselor and with the appropriate support people. I will say, as far as what we do with it, I think Marshalltown has been, oh man, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, but 10 years? 11 years?
Yeah, you're right about right there. Yep.
Yeah. And so we started as total voluntary, and it was an after school thing that was met in the library. And now we do it at school. And so our principal is on board and very supportive of what we do. We have an application process, but then we also have I'm real big on systems, and I don't see all 1,400 kids that I have at school. So I'm really good with going to the people that they see on a daily basis. They're English teachers because everybody has English, and then maybe their counselors or their administrator. But one thing I'm very cognizant of, and Mr. Dale and Mr. Terry, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because we have so many different immigrant groups at my school and migratory groups within our school, it's very imperative that you get individuals from each walk of life. And this goes for your arts versus your athletics versus your band versus your social climbers versus your media influencers. I think it's important to have what is reflected in your classroom. And having said that, we have a very large Burmese population that was not participating when I first got involved. And that was one thing that was very apparent to me, but they would cluster around certain kids. And so it was very important, and I was very cognizant of finding one of those leaders and kind of picking them out and saying, I think you need to do this. I think you need to be the spokesperson for your community. I think that you would be great, handling this within your demographics or within your community or being the voice of your group. I think it's very important, even when other people think of, I've had some pushback with some of the leaders we picked because there was a group of kids that was very, very negative and getting in a lot of violent situations within the hallway. It would start with conversations, looks, motions, things like that, and then would end up in physical aggression. So, and that happened at the school that they were previously at, and then they moved to the high school. So one key thing is I look within those groups and I see those group dynamics, and it's something I learned somewhere else and with my psychology background, and I try and find those negative leaders and try to put them into a positive aspect. And I think that's very imperative for the sake of your school, because if you can get those negative leaders on your side, your school's going to run differently. I will second that what Shannon said, it's not a one and done training with these kids. Sometimes it's a day check in, check out with some of these kids. And that's what I would say with like your negative leaders, that's a check in, check out. How did your day go? How did your classes run? Did you notice anything? Did you interject? Did you stand up? Were you a bystander or were you an outstander? What were you? How did you show up today? That's the question we always go back to at my school is, who do you want to be when you show up today? And who do you want people to perceive you as? Are you holding up or are you holding down? So those are some of the big questions that we always go back to every time we have a conversation, whether it's in the hall, on the bus, in the classroom. We have those conversations constantly, and we go back to those three questions. The other key thing when you're training, you've got to let your kids train too and give them classroom management skills. I'm totally on board with this. If they do not know how to manage the classroom and you've got a weak teacher in there or a substitute teacher that maybe doesn't have the class all the way under control, and you have these leaders go in there, the student leaders, and they have no idea how to control a class, you're not going to get anything out of it. So you have to have the classroom management skills. You have to teach those to your mentors. You have to teach them about proximity. You have to teach them about calling out the person that maybe is not wanting to share. How do you get your wallflowers to talk? I think those skills are imperative to go through. Now, before COVID, we spent 3 days a week together with my mentors doing their classroom lesson one day, their college lesson the next day, and then we'd go through our MVP training. And the fourth day was kind of a flux of homework, whatever, and it's a 45-minute period. And then on Fridays, they would be, and we trained on Wednesday. So Fridays they would be back in their mentoring classrooms, and they spent a whole class period with their kids. It was great. It was phenomenal. Well, now COVID happened. And I know some of us are, the way that the schedules are getting set up, that maybe MVP is on the back burner, but I have been working with ways with Mr. Terry and Mr. Dale and Ms. Wyant to put it back on the front burner within the different classrooms. So we have, and I've shared this with our stat group and on the workplace thing, we do a newsletter right now, and the kids are starting to pull some information. They're writing the next newsletter, some of my kids. It's important to keep communication up, especially during COVID. It was very interesting because we had communication go down because we were in isolation, but I had mentors going, okay, how do I contact this kid? And I'm like, okay, well, they're going to have an English 9 meeting on this day. Do you want to pop in there? I can ask the teacher. And they were like, yeah, I'll do it. So they were popping in to different classrooms and seeing if they could support them, homework. What do you need? How are you feeling? How are things going? It was great. It was phenomenal. And this summer, I know Mr. Terry has sat in on a couple things, and Mr. Dale, you've seen a couple things that have happened. Our mentors are active. We had discussions that were insanely good and gotten people to feel comfortable with coming back. And when I say the SEL connection, it's so imperative that our kids feel safe, and this program helps them feel safe. And I can tell you, looking at the data that we've crunched, I know that our referrals have gone down with this program, and I know that our mentors play a big impact. We normally only pull from juniors and seniors. There's an application process and recommendation process. But this year, because of COVID and how we're having to do it, I'm looking at having over 100 mentors and I have 4 people helping me out. We need to get small groups so that they can meet and still do their stuff, because there may not time to do things.
Yeah. Joe, thanks. What Shannon and Joe both shared was the idea about making sure that your mentors are really a kind of a cross section, as diverse as your student body. That's the mentors. That group needs to resemble that. Eric, just real quickly, as we're thinking about mentors and the recruitment of and the training of mentors, one thing that I've appreciated about this model is that this was the very first national approach to bullying and gender violence prevention that intentionally work to engage more young men in the conversation, right? And having understanding the importance of all those voices, because oftentimes those voices are the ones that are least likely to say something or to show up, oftentimes for a lot of societal reasons. But Eric, you do a lot of work and training with developing young men, particularly there at Des Moines Hoover. Any tips or suggestions about how to making sure that you're identifying some of your male leaders in your buildings to recruit them as mentors? Would you
Yeah, just kind of touching back with what Joe was saying is identifying, all your students with leadership qualities, whether they're perceived as positive or negative. They have strong leadership skills that other kids know, not just the adults in the school buildings, and they're drawn to those kids. I have 2 particular young men, both African American. One kid is involved in sports, athletic. He's very involved. He goes to Central Campus. He does presentations on diversity and different topics that he has presented on. He's even participated in the 515 movement here in Des Moines. And another kid, he also plays athletics, but to most teachers, he's more of like your quote unquote street guy or somebody that's getting in trouble. The kid's very intellectual. I mean, him and this other kid can go day and night and talking about different things with diversity, racism, equity, just different topics when we're talking about MVP, gender stereotypes, which a lot of the kids in there, they kind of knew that already, but when I had teachers pop in and they would hear, both kids talk to the rest of the group, they were impressed that this other kid, that they had a perceived notion that he was just negative or he was just bad, talk about these things, and he would actually bring like a group of 10 kids with him every time, and I would feed into it. I would give them questions, and I would let them run with it, and just kind of have them discuss and have the group take off with both of them having discussions, which is what MVP is like great at, is just being able to provide topics, and you're just kind of there to kind of like keep people within a certain construct, and you just kind of keep fanning the flame for, you know, juicy conversations that come up that are very educational. But it would just be that, it just be very cognizant about including everyone, whether you're doing it just specific with males or females, or if you're doing a mixed group. Always keep an eye for those kids who may come up after the session to you and have discussions. Maybe calling them next time and see what their point of view is. Kind of regressing a little bit with what everybody's discussion about implementation is that one of the things that I learned is I facilitated to teach staff at Hoover before we started teaching students at Hoover. And one of the things that caught my attention real big is a lot of the staff know what topic to talk about and how to deal with certain things, the emotional management, you know, they know how to respond to certain things. These kids do not. As part of the social emotional learning processes that, you know, within MVP, you're giving them the opportunity to work those things out in those discussions and like develop those skills of how do I react when I'm in those situations, and work through that, and bringing that up to like the teachers that are helping you teach these students that, hey, this is your role as a teacher, is to give that student the opportunity to have the tools that you may have already because you're an adult. And sometimes you hear that frustration when you have mentees in a room talking about something, and the teachers in there that are there to help them, they may shut some things down that other kids are saying because it's not inappropriate or it's bad language. I'm just like, hey, that's where they're at. Meet them where they're at, and then just unpack what they're talking about and help them grow instead of shutting them down. And because then from there on, they have a certain perceived notion about MVP, but like, well, I can't talk about this because I said shit in the classroom. And you know, it's just being cognizant of all those things. It's just being holistic all around constantly, because it's evolving always. So yeah.
Eric, thank you. So I'm very cognizant of the time. We've got just a couple of minutes left here, and one of the areas that we haven't got a chance to talk too much about is the implementation piece. And it was already mentioned about pre-COVID, post-COVID. This I think would lend itself to another discussion here in the next few weeks. I was asked though to share with you, Perry High School is starting MVP this fall. They right now today are in the process of training, having some training with their mentors. Perry is going to, right now they're going to an in-person approach, return to learn. Others, a lot of districts are going to a hybrid, 50%, et cetera. Some are going totally, or no one's going totally online right now without the permission, but I don't think that's going to happen in Iowa. Anyway, so they're practicing social distancing, kids are masked up, they're in the gymnasium, they're doing what we would normally do in going to a high school and working with mentors. Two members from the MVP statewide assistance team are there right now with them, walking them through all these activities that I just talked about. They're going to be also be giving us assigning scenarios to student mentors to practice those scenarios and the questioning, the 10 facilitation questions that are associated with those. But just within this last 2 minutes here before we wind down, Shannon and or Joe, any thoughts about your next steps in your respective buildings as it relates to implementation?
We're going hybrid, I know that, and the implementation that we're doing right now is I'm looking at one mentor to 2 to 3 freshmen. So I know that that is a really low number, but I think it's manageable for the students that we have. as far as implementing as a whole group, we have done some virtual trainings with some different kids. I've been doing it all summer long. I'll be real honest with you. I have not stopped working. I had to problem solve, and we as a district have had to problem solve. And I think that we need to think outside the box. So I've had some virtual trainings, and I am doing the newsletter, and I am doing weekly emails. I'm trying my best to make sure that these kids are informed and that we are keeping up to speed with everything. The conflict I'm having is that some of our students who are mentors, because they're doing the AA program too, have chosen all online schooling. So they got that choice, and so they're not going to even be in the school. So, and we've had that problem in the past where they've gone to MCC for most of their school day, and then they come over for MVP only. So this year they're just going to do it virtually on that aspect as much as I can get done. And, you know, we've got to use the tools that are at our hands, some of video recordings, things like that. I love tech, so I think that's imperative that we implement it with tech, that we're going forward. And the websites, if you guys need the website for all the slides and stuff, I know we have our created one. I know Alan has one from another school. We utilize that stuff so that the training can be, or the scenarios can be done virtually anywhere. And I do tell all my mentors that they need to record their meeting for their safety and the safety of their mentees. I think that's imperative to say, because if you don't have that, I hate to say it, but evidence of what might have occurred, there might be some kind of conversation that maybe is missed, or maybe one says it happened and another said it didn't. You just want to have that for everybody's safety. And I just frame it like that to the kids. I say, as educators, we have to record all of our meetings with you guys. It's the same thing when you're mentoring. And then I want those recordings, because then I house them under your name and I can show that you met, because we use our program for silver cord hours. So this is the verifiable evidence that you did your thing, so you get your silver cord hour. And then they go, oh, okay. And then that's it. That's no more conversation about it. It's just an expectation.
Yeah. Joe, that's excellent, and I'd love to explore more of that process, you know, later on here, early fall. Shannon, what would you add to the implementation piece, and then we'll need to wind down.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this brief. I noticed we didn't say something earlier about your training. Also, kind of in a handbook, consider a good conduct policy for students. I did have a mentor who did get MIP. And in our policy, they have to sit out the semester of the charge, and then they can reapply, but there are some steps that they have to take to prove that they're ready to be a mentor again. So just kind of keep that in mind. As for this fall, my school is back 100%. We're not doing anything hybrid or anything like that. So we will have block schedules where we run half of an 8-period day for the quarter, and then the other half of the 8-period day, the second quarter, so that we're limiting contact. And my MVP is incorporated in with my counseling lessons. So while freshmen receive their counseling curriculum, I go into the English 9 or the history or the science, depending on how it works into the schedule. And then my mentors will have a day that they do that. It works really well for days that you have a sub. And the sub will be in the room with them. But in my district, because of the content of the information that's being shared, one of the counseling team has to be present. So if it's face-to-face, I'm in the room. And I'll tell you what, that's the hardest thing, to cross your mouth and put your, to let the discussion happen, because as adults, we want to guide them. But take your duct tape, sit in the corner of the room and help supervise. That way you can help also manage the classroom. If we go back to online, curriculum program still has, the counseling curriculum still has to be taught. The mentors will be in the room, and in all of our Zoom meetings for our school, our district says that an adult has to be present. And then me as the adult in the room, I hit the record button, and that's how we go about it. So
Yep.
Kind of
Awesome.
in a nutshell, that's how we're transitioning things.
Thank you, Shannon. I kept everybody over the time limit. And so I want to just really thank everybody for their thoughts and their thinking this morning. What you can expect from me is to receive an email with some links to the web page of the MVP facilitation team that will have their contact information. Several folks on here, Joe, Shannon, Tom, Eric, etc., and then Rachel, and you'll have access to that. But also, some things that I didn't get to today was talking more about the scenarios. You'll also receive our copy of digital scenarios. Again, as Joe mentioned, it can all be done online. With technology, it's been a great thing to have, and I love the idea with the mentors connecting with 2 to 3 of the mentees. That's exactly the same model, Joe, just FYI, that some of the universities are doing with as they welcome the first year students back to school. I see them in my hallway right outside my office talking to a person, to an older student online about welcoming them to the campus. So anyway, some things to be mindful of, but I think it would be really helpful for us to maybe think about coming back together again in a few weeks and talking about some strategies, right, that we're using in this time of COVID. And again, just pulling from your expertise and your experiences. So with that, thank you, everyone. Those of you who I haven't met yet today, until today, it's great to meet you, and I look forward to speaking with you online or in person in the next few weeks. So again, have a great rest of the summer. Be safe, be well, and thank you for joining us today. All right, see you, everyone.
Hey, everyone. Bye.